Buhari salutes Nigerian women as they celebrate 2021 International Day.
More senior government officials in Nigeria get vaccinated against COVID-19.
National Hajj Commission of Nigeria begins preparation for 2021 Hajj amid COVID-19 pandemic.
On Good Morning Nigeria today, we shall discuss the disparity in deposit and lending rates and the effects on the Nigerian economy.
Now, it is generally believed that deposit and lending rates to a large extent determine the magnitude or otherwise of investment in the banking sector.
The Apex Bank tries to moderate the rates at which banks charge for lending, and more particularly also in seeking to promote the nation's economy.
But over the years, the issue of deposit and lending rates in the banking sector has become a worrisome dimension, as the bankers now tend to charge higher for lending and give less for deposit, thereby milking the depositors dry.
Now, commercial banks charge prime lending rates, sometimes as high as 24 to 26% per annum. So one can imagine the rates at which they will charge other customers.
And you know, Kingsley, this is really worrisome because banks take money from people at 1% and lend to others at 26%. So why won't banks continue to declare high profits on a yearly basis at the expense of the customer and by extension, the economy?
So the big question, Jumai, that's what we have raised. But other questions also yearning for responses are, what are the factors that usually account for the huge disparity in the deposit and lending rates? As we just indicated, 24 to 26%, that's on the average. Sometimes, by the time they add the wide range of other charges, it could be as high as 30%. So why are banks also not having fairly uniform lending rates? Of course, it depends on the nature of the bank, but why are we having these huge disparities? And sometimes, too, you find that when you go to the banking halls, neither the savings nor lending rates are displayed as otherwise expected by the banks.
And you know, Kingsley, we need to ask these pertinent questions. What roles should technology play in making the operational cost of banks low, thereby reducing the lending rates? What should be done to regulate the rates to increase investment in the sector and the economy? Well, these are the issues we intend to address as we discuss disparity in deposit and lending rates, effects on Nigerian economy on Good Morning Nigeria today. I am Juma Yusuf. Thanks so much for joining us.
And I'm Kingsley Osadolo. I also welcome you to this edition of Good Morning Nigeria, reaching you live on the network service of the Nigerian Television Authority. As usual, we have our complimentary segments, and these include newspaper review, business, and others. Right now, let's join Tessie Omeri for the highlights of the morning news. Good morning, Tessie.
Hello, good morning, Kingsley and Jummai. Good morning and welcome to the morning news. President Muhammad Buhari has felicitated with Nigerian women, describing them as the bedrock of society, noting that the theme of the 2021 celebration, Choose to Challenge, is quite apt. In a statement by the Special Advisor to the President on Media and Publicity, Femi Adesina stated that the President rejoices with the women folk and restates his administration's commitment to addressing the multifarious challenges confronting them at various levels of the society. With 7 female ministers and 2 of them heading strategic ministries of finance and budget and national planning and humanitarian affairs and disaster management and social development, in addition to scores more in charge of key parastatals and agencies, as well as serving as presidential aides. President Buhari applauds their contributions to the successes recorded by the administration. He condemns all forms of gender-based discriminations, abuse, harassment and violence targeted especially at the female folk, at workplaces, schools, community and national levels. And meanwhile, Nigeria's First Lady Aisha Muhammadu Buhari wishes women all over the world Happy Women's Day for their resilience, hard work and commitment to the progress of humanity. In a statement on marking 2021 International Women's Day, the First Lady says with the theme, Women in Leadership Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World, is a strong call to appreciate the efforts of women and girls in the fight against COVID-19 pandemic. The First Lady also condemns the abduction of Nigerian students by insurgents and bandits and calls on all stakeholders to continue to exert their different levels of influence and bring this menace to an end. President Muhammadu Buhari has expressed satisfaction with successful conclusion of Niger Republic election. This was while exchanging views with the former Vice President of Nigeria, Muhammadu Namadi Sambo, who led the ECOWAS mission on election in Niger. President Buhari said with Nigeria sharing more than 1,400 kilometers of border with the Republic of Niger, he should be concerned with the political stability of their neighboring country. More strategic leaders in the country have continued to present themselves for vaccination against COVID-19 pandemic. The latest to receive the jab was the Chief of Staff to the President, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, and other senior government officials.
All eligible Nigerians should take this vaccine. It is safe and it is painless. And the benefit is immense because it's not just for the individual, but the more Nigerians that are vaccinated, the more we develop the herd immunity, which will keep our country safe and our people healthy.
The vaccine is efficacious and it is safe. We need to safeguard our population. We need to safeguard the health of Nigerians.
Similarly, members of the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19, led by the Chairman and Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Boss Mustafa, received the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine against COVID-19. The PTF says the action is to further demonstrate to Nigerians that the vaccine is safe for citizens to receive.
We are willing to take the vaccines in the public glare for every Nigerian to see, to attest to the fact that what is being offered is safe, is very effective, and it will help us in taming the spread of COVID-19.
And 371 new COVID-19 infections have been recorded in the country in the last 24 hours. In the latest figures released by Nigeria Center for Disease Control, Lagos State has the highest number of new infections, 102, followed by Enugu with 66, then Edo State with 56. FCT recorded 23 cases, Ogun 20, Osun and Bayelsa recorded 18 each. Rivers State recorded 15, while Kaduna 14 and Plateau has 10. Other states with new cases are Oyo 8, Bauchi 7, Kano 5, Delta 4. Nasarawa recorded 3 cases, Niger has 2, while Ekiti recorded 1 new case. Nigeria now has 158,906 confirmed cases of COVID-19, with 138,502 patients treated and discharged, while 1,982 died of the virus. Preparatory to the 2021 Hajj exercise, the National Hajj Commission of Nigeria has met with Committee of Ulamas across the country on the best way to conduct the exercise amid COVID-19 pandemic.
Without vaccines, there is no Hajj. So there's nothing that we can argue about it.
We know there are so many people from other countries there that come for Hajj, and we want to educate our people, give them orientation.
We pray that the curve of the COVID will be flattened.
The 2023 general elections must be different from all previous elections in terms of preparations. This assurance is from the INEC chairman, Professor Mahmoud Yakubu, as he meets resident electoral commissioners to finalize preparations for the resumption of continuous voters registration expansion of polling units.
Those who wish to replace their lost or damaged PVCs, as well as those who are already registered but who may wish to apply for transfer of their registration from one location to another, will be able to do so as provided by law.
And that concludes the morning news. Good Morning Nigeria continues with Kingsley and Jumai after this break. Thanks for watching.
Welcome back. Federal government on course to lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty as skilled farmers urges government to use agriculture as foundation for economic development. Kulne Ade has details.
One of the latest drives of the federal government to empower young Nigerians is the distribution of 64 sewing machines to Abuja Enterprise Agency as part of efforts to facilitate the floating of Fashion Center in Abuja to train young Nigerians in fashion and design. This is part of activities to mark the 64th birthday of the Vice President, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, Special Advisor to the President on Community Development and Civic Engagement Office of the Vice President, Olatoyosi Onolapo, says this is part of the federal government's effort to empower 100 million Nigerians.
And then they go and train for 2 weeks, and we begin to do surely job. He said, but I have confidence in Abuja Enterprise Agency that a minimum of 8-week curriculum will be instilled in whoever is coming to train, and that they will train them properly and professionally, and these people will get certificates.
First of all, I will tell you rightly that it is going to enhance the livelihoods of the MSMEs. Yes, like you rightly said, we've been doing it, but this is seems to be a very different thing altogether.
In another development, a skilled farmer, Restin Tereke, has urged all tiers of government to use agriculture as the basic foundation for sustainable economic development now that the economy is out of recession.
So that you can mitigate the challenges that ordinarily should have arisen from COVID-19. It was a very tough year. It was a tough year with our investors. It was a very tough year with markets. Because if you don't move goods, you cannot sell. If you don't sell, you cannot make money. If you are not making money, you are not surviving. Sometimes we wish that the fourth quarter of 2020 is written off books of history. It was the worst year the farm ever had. We lost money, but at the end of the day, what you must keep doing is to keep building. Because at the end, it is value that determines longevity. It is value that determines process and productivity. And so because the farm has been able to build value over the years, it was easier for us to continue to survive. But thankfully, December last year, Central Bank supported a farm with about 734 million.
He said the sector should be treated as national treasure. With Business News, I'm Kunle Adeyeye.
That's Business Package. Up next is Newspaper Review.
And our newspaper reviewer, Bayo Toby, is in the studio. Good morning, Bayo.
Good morning, Jumai. I didn't see you to say Happy International Women's Day yesterday.
Yeah.
Good morning, Kingsley. Good morning, Nigeria.
Our day yesterday. Well, let's now begin with the Punch newspaper this morning. Just above the masthead, we have state orders not funding 3.5 million workers' pension. That's attributed to PENCOM. You find details on page 33. Vaccine distribution begins. Lagos orders wait. SGF VIP stake jabs. You find details on page 39. Aisha Buhari breaks silence, laments insistent abduction of women. You find details on page 9. Oil falls after hitting $70 per barrel. OPEC Plus output plunges. Details on page 33. Just below the masthead, Ogun, Katsina, Anambra, 7 governors stick to illegal local government caretaker panels. With kickers, Anambra yet to hold local government poll since 2013. Katsina last local government poll held 2014. Directors of personnel running Kwara local governments. Sokoto held last local government poll 2016. Panels on aberration Oze-Homo, and it's against constitution, says SAN. And just like Bayo was saying yesterday, we celebrated the International Women's Day, and you can see women out in their numbers on the streets during a protest against hunger and insecurity to mark the International Women's Day in Lagos. Gumi, opinion merchants must stop divisive comments. That's coming from the army. Niger plans to arm vigilantes against bandits. You find details on page 7. Dollar video, Ganduje seeks amendment of claims witnesses. You find details on page 32. At the bottom plate of the Punch newspaper, MFLA meets Senate today on alleged $9.5 million PPT fund missing. You find details on page 33. Gunmen killed Plateau businessman, injured 2 others. You find it on page 4 and 5. It is a shame constructing Abuja-Lokoja 200-kilometer road for 15 years. That's coming from the CAN president. Kingsley.
Okay, we also take a look at the Daily Trust newspaper. 5 reasons Nigerian president won 1.905 billion naira leadership prize. That's page 14. Nigeria needs $1.5 trillion GDP to tackle debt and poverty. That's according to financial analyst Rewane. This story says Niger to arm vigilante with pump-action guns. Will not disband groups. That's according to Governor Sani Bello. No negotiation with bandits. 2 brides to be and 17 others kidnapped. Those are the 3 riders to that headline. And photograph there shows 2 female IDPs exhibiting their skills at producing men's caps during the International Women's Day celebration at Durumi IDP camp in Abuja. That was yesterday. NDLEA uncovers cocaine cache in Anambra Monarch's Palace. That's page 5. UNESCO scores Buhari high on women inclusion in governance. Guard your utterances. Army wants Gumi. Bayo.
Well, let's start with the celebration of International Women's Day. President Muhammadu Buhari says his administration is committed to addressing the multifarious challenges confronting women so that at various levels of our society, so that they can continue to give their best. He says females form a substantial part of our population, almost half, and therefore they are a crucial component. We risk stunted growth if we, by any means, we do not take their significance into consideration. He pointed out that his administration has 7 female ministers, some of who are occupying strategic ministries. Scores of them are also heading parastatals and agencies, while others are serving as presidential aide, all to contribute to their quota to the success of his administration. The president promised to support further female inclusiveness in all sectors of national life. He declared, "I'm proud of our women who have shown by dint of hard work and capacity and are performing creditably at home and abroad." Meanwhile, the First Lady, Aisha Buhari, tweeted from Dubai that the rising cases of abduction, especially of schoolgirls, must end. She urged stakeholders to continue to exert their influence to end schoolgirls' abduction, so as to ensure that girls are safe anywhere they might find themselves. She says that the theme of the International Women's Day in leadership achieving an equal future for COVID-19 world is apt and is appreciating the role of women in that. Talking about COVID-19 now, Boss Mustafa led members of the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 to get inoculated yesterday. Those inoculated include the Ministers of Health, Foreign Affairs, Information, the World Health Organization representatives. Others include the Director General of the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, the Executive Director of Nigeria Primary Healthcare Development Agency, as well as 4 journalists considered to be critical frontliners in the fight against COVID-19. The Secretary to the Government of the Federation said, "In this war, we are all involved. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe." Meanwhile, the governor of Kogi State, Governor Yahaya Bello, says that he does not need to take COVID-19 vaccination. He says that nothing is wrong with him and he is hale and hearty. Asked if he will encourage Kogais to take the vaccine, he said, "COVID-19 is not our business in Kogi State. We have more prominent issues and serious matters than COVID-19. Meanwhile, the Nigerian Army has warned that as a national institution, it does not deploy troops along ethnic or religious lines. Spokesman for the Army, Brigadier General Mohammed Yerima, reacted to a video clip that is going on the social media where Islamic critic Dr. Ahmad Gumi is quoted to be telling bandits that soldiers involved in most attacks against them were non-Muslims. The Army warns that the cleric and others described as opinion merchants to desist from disparaging the Nigerian Army. He said Nigerian Army should not be dragged into the mud by their utterances. He emphasized that the Army is the one and only national institution that should not be disparaged, and opinion leaders should take cognizance of the immediate and national security implication of what they say so as not to cause confusion. Gunmen mounted a roadblock and abducted 10 passengers, including an infant. They took the infant and let the mother away. 7 people were taken. This was at a village, Chanchangi, on the road between Takum and Wukari. The mother is said to be in the trauma now and is in hospital. Also, gunmen invaded Kutunku village, which is along Ushishi and Zungeru Road. 11 males and 8 females were abducted. 2 of the females were to be married this weekend. The same Kuntuku village, about a week ago, 50 passengers were abducted from 3 commercial vehicles as they were passing. And in Benin, an assistant superintendent of police who was kidnapped in his home as his wife and children walked helplessly on Sunday has been rescued. The officer was abducted at gunpoint at Ogida quarters. The audacity of the government was that they not only abducted a policeman, they also had the effrontery to demand ransom. The Commissioner of Police, Edo State, garnered together the technical and strike force rescued him, and they have rescued him. He is now receiving treatment in hospital, not because of anything, but because of the beating he received from his abductors. Coming to talk about COVID-19, today we had 371 new cases in 17 states. Yesterday we had 269, and that was obviously because Lagos was missing. Lagos is back today with 102 cases. The Nigerian Tribune reports, however, that we are beginning to flatten the curve. The newspaper observed that last week, that is week 21st of February to 27, Nigeria recorded the lowest of 2,817 cases in 3 months. It says that from the samples that were taken, 48,090 was higher, but yet the number of positive cases had continued to decline. So far, 1,969 deaths have been recorded. As we enter into week 63, which is this week, COVID-19 so far has seen 1,544,008 persons with their samples taken. And as today, we have 158,906 positive cases and 1,982 deaths.
Well, it's good news that the vaccine is here. And if people can just trust it, like I was telling Kingsley before we came on air, and I said, you know, it's scary at times, but I hope more Nigerians will embrace it and take it so that the curve will just be flattened completely.
Well,
for the country to move
vaccine is one of the safety valves. Yeah. Vaccine, when taken, will help to protect. And not only that, it will also go a long way to reducing the instances of the incidence of COVID-19. However, there have been a lot of naysayers and a lot of speculation causing doubts on vaccination. For instance, when President Muhammadu Buhari took his own vaccination and the Vice President on Saturday, there were already speculation and rumor that there was adverse reaction.
Yes.
So much so that the presidential spokesman assistant, the special assistant to the president, had to come and say the president is hale at hearty and there has not been any reaction. With the vaccine, we have a long way to go, yes, but it is the safest way to tread. And around the world, there have been instances of reactions to vaccine. Naturally, some persons have a tendency to react to vaccines, but if you look at it and the proportion, they are not very, very high. It is only in Norway that they had to stop giving the AstraZeneca because 2 persons, one nurse, one died, the other also suffered from adverse reaction. And they stopped from that batch, and they are still trying to find out what was responsible for the adverse reactions.
Well, in a number of countries, several millions have been vaccinated.
79 million in the United States,
yes,
and over 30% in the United Kingdom.
You know, that's several millions have been vaccinated. And so if those several millions who have been vaccinated haven't gone down, as it were, then what is the scaremongering about? And the conspiracy theorists are still seeking to justify their initial theories as to what the vaccine might do if you took it. And as you rightly observed, other vaccinations that we've had in the past have also produced some adverse reactions. I recall vividly sometime in 1971, there was some vaccination we took. I don't remember what it was for, but I recall it was after the war. It was on the left arm. My brother first took it, and of course he couldn't lift his arm. I took mine. I also couldn't lift my arm following day, and it was all around. People saw that, but it was after a few days, of course, the pain went off. I also remember taking the CSM vaccination during the youth service. The only adverse reaction I had was constant itching around the point of vaccination. It lingered for a while, and then after that, of course, it also disappeared. So there are people who react in different ways depending on your body constitution and all that. But the clearest message is that what is the purpose of vaccination? Nigeria is also experienced in the administration of vaccination. Yes. Vaccination has been hailed just like penicillin. Penicillin antibacterial vaccination to protect against a wide range of viruses, including polio. Why was the world so concerned about eradicating white polio from the surface of the earth? Of course, I think it's always somewhere around Pakistan and Afghanistan where they still have it, but you could see the celebration that we had here in Nigeria. And by the way, you do not take vaccination because you are sick. It is when you are healthy that you take the vaccination. It is meant as a prophylaxis to protect you. To protect you. You cannot be a Superman to say that you will not take the vaccine because you are not.
Well, a vaccine is supposed to prepare your human resistance to be able to attack the intruding virus when it comes into your body.
We still need to continue with non-pharmaceutical protocols.
Of course,
even
yes,
after
we
vaccine.
need to.
That's what Nigerians should know. Okay, let's now go quickly to the editorials. We don't have much time, and we're taking the Think subsidy removal. It's from the Nation newspaper. To fend off huge social cost, FG should retain the current fuel pump price. It went further to say that the government should tread carefully on subsidy removal. The attendant social cost and socio-economic dislocations might be incalculable if not well handled.
Well, it's a case that we want subsidy to be removed, but we don't want increase in petrol pump price. Yeah. And the implications are simple. It's a case of we pray because our crude oil is a cornerstone of our economy. We want high crude price, but it has to go concomitantly with the pump price because subsidy has been removed. So what they are saying, the editorial is saying that government must retain the current pump price and not increase it. It is a case of saying that we want to have our cake, and at the same time eat it.
Okay.
But the challenge is simple, like has always been pointed out
You can never have your cake and
Good Morning Nigeria.
eat your cake and have it. It's not possible.
Good. Unless our refineries are functioning, there is no way we can undercut or pay for high cost of petrol. Another factor is the fact that the GMD NNPC, when he resumed office, said production cost of crude oil is about $30 per barrel. And he promised that they are going to try to bring it down to $10 per barrel. If it comes down, then the crude oil that is given NNPC can be afforded to be given at a lower rate than what it is now. That is the only time we will be able to have cheaper pump price, provided we are able to protect it from being smuggled across the border.
Bayo Atoyobi, we appreciate your being around. See you again tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right, it's Good Morning Nigeria on NTA's network service. We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll get ahead with our item for discussion.
Thanks for joining us. And to begin our conversation, let's take this Fox Pop put together by Abdusalam Jibril.
I belong to the class of those many Nigerians who feels that in the midst of pandemic, in the midst of economic hardship, in the midst of so many issues affect the ordinary people, the poor people, the bank charge rate, the deposit rate, the lending rate, the maintenance rate, all the rate, that it is too much. Not just for the individual, even for the SMEs, who's supposed to be the major driver of the economy. So banks are making so stringent measures to restrain, to make it, cumbersome for ordinary people to live and enjoy life, to contribute to their quota to the national economy.
Right now, if I want to go into business, those days you could meet somebody and just say, lend me, and you move on. Or even when you go to the banks, but you have just mentioned that the lending rate is 30%. It's so much. How much will you make of that money? And it is not just straight, that is 30% straight. It is as you are paying, and if you do not pay for a while, it increases them more. So it is not helpful at all.
Well, for me as a businessman, looking at the lending rates, if a lending rate is about 30% and you are doing business and there are multiple taxes coming in, how do you now break even in the business that you do? So I think it's a high level of insensitivity.
Government agencies have been monitoring, but I think they should come up with a more strategy that will enable all banks to adhere to the instruction that have been given to the commercial banks. So that is what I think they should do, and at the same time, they should, a kind of doing auditing, checking and monitoring them from time to time.
All right, with us in the studios now to discuss this issue, let's welcome our regular guest, Ni Akinseju, who's a financial and investment analyst. Mr. Akinseju, pleasure to have you this morning.
A pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Also here with us in the studio is a former banker and now a human rights activist, Ahmed Abubakar Tanemu. Tanemu, delighted to have you this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. And
joining us from Lagos via Zoom is Johnson Chukwu, CEO, Cowrie Asset Management Limited and financial analyst. You're welcome to the program. We also have
good morning.
Good morning. We also have joining us from our Sokoto studio, Shuaibu Idris, financial analyst and member of National Institute. It's a pleasure to have you join us. And from our Kaduna studio, we're being joined by Professor Yeshua Ango, Professor of Finance and Entrepreneurship. He's also Dean, School of Postgraduate Studies, Kaduna State University. Thanks so much for joining us on the program. You're welcome to Good Morning Nigeria.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure once again to have you with us on to this edition of the program. And the critical focus, of course, has to do with what has been a lingering issue, particularly with regard to deposit money banks. That's to say, the rate at which you deposit your money and then the rate at which the banks on-lend to their customers. Persons have often complained about the huge disparity, but apparently nothing has been done about this, and it continues to be so. Some analysts have indicated this as perhaps one of the key reasons why we are not seeing a great deal of growth in different sectors, because the rates, according to them, are largely usurious. So let's just begin by having an exploration around the whole issue of deposit money banks and then lending. Nia Kinsijo, let's begin with you in the studios. Banks, of course, are in the business of receiving deposits and then on lending to their customers, and in the process, the so-called spread is where they make their money. And year on year, we see and hear about the huge billions that they are making in this economy that also boasts of several millions of unemployed persons.
Yeah. Well, except that at this time I'm not going to covet the huge billions the banks are making. But I think really the point where we need to start would be the regulatory authority over the banking system, which is the CBN. And in all charges and rates, all are encapsulated in the guides to banks and other financial institution charges. So I think I know to a large extent whatever charges are are made by banks are properly instituted in the guide to bank charges. I try again to look at the philosophy, that is that the central bank that is guiding the central bank in its relationship with the financial institutions. To a large extent, the central bank had perhaps since 2018 or thereabouts, determined to liberalize and democratize access to credit. And to that extent, what needed to do was to find a way of reducing interest rates, And in doing that, there must be an alignment between rates on savings, rates on deposits, and of course rates on lending, And if you recall, between 2016 and 2018, the MPR, the monetary policy rate, was at 14%. And of course, the MPR will determine, that's a benchmark of interest rates. And since then, especially 2019 through to 2020, there had been a progressive downward reduction in the MPR. And what that tells us is that the CBN is trying to create an accommodative environment for credit. Now, what I'm trying to say essentially is that the alignment constantly must be between deposit and lending. We cannot look at deposit alone without looking at lending. So if the rates on lending is low, it is not actually through the machination of the banks. There are directives by the CBN, to the banks. For instance, the latest directive, and I think that was sometimes in 2020, was that deposit rates will be charged at 10% of MPR. So that means whatever the MPR rate will be, what you are going to charge, what the interest you are going to pay on deposit will be 10% of it. At that time, I think MPR was 11.5%. And so it means 10% will be 1.5% or thereabouts. So that's that. Now, the CBN had now gone ahead by, of course, reducing MPR is a signal to to banks to also reduce their lending rates. But more than that, the CBN also discouraged the banks too from depositing with it through the standing deposit facility. What that does, what banks usually do is when there is a surfeit of liquidity in the system, they will take the excess liquidity in their own system and go and save with the central bank. Before, I think by 2010, it was 2009, it was like as much as you have, bring it. But by 2010, that was reduced. And I know specifically in 2014, it was, if you are going to bring any money, the limited cap was 7.5 billion per day that you can bring. And the rate was also reduced to about 8.5%. And then the latest rate is you cannot deposit more than 2 billion naira. The banks cannot deposit more than 2 billion naira at the SDF. And the maximum rate that will be charged will be 4.5%. So to a large extent, it's also a way of discouraging savings, by the banks. And what the CBN is doing is, if you have so much, you are compelled to lend out. Don't come and save with us. One, you cannot save more than 2 billion. If you are saving more than 2 billion, no, we are not going to pay any interest on it. And that 2 billion, we are paying just about 4.5%. It's the same philosophy that I extend to the retail savers, the retail depositors, that the general thing is also to discourage savings. The whole idea that is that is compelling the CBN to drive this line is to encourage production and productivity by the public assessing credit at cheaper rates.
Okay, thank you. Ahmed Abubakar, let me come to you. So much technicalities. It's my head is going around trying to absorb what he's saying, and that is me. How many Nigerians are aware of this disparity between lending and deposit in these banks? Even if they go to collect loans, are they educated enough to understand it itself? Can you break it down?
Yeah, let me take it in a practical sense. What he has said is what the regulators have put in place. But in actual fact, you go to a regular bank, what obtains? To a small-scale retail business, my going concern is flourishing and I want to obtain a banking facility. For a customer, it's not only about the rate per se. There are other things that goes with it. Let me give you a typical example. You want to maybe an advance payment guarantee, an overdraft, a term loan. They're asking you to bring a collateral. It could be a property that worth maybe 500 million. On that, you are expected to pay for valuation. That means the value, the property, they give the professional valuers. They are expected to embark on visitation, that's the bank. They are expected to conduct search by the legal person, and they are expected to create legal mortgage. All these costs, they are apart from the normal charges. So at the end of it all, the amount you are paying for that loan that you've taken is much more higher than what the lending rate stipulates. And equally, there's the issue of default, maybe due to challenges. The government is giving moratorium and asking those that have government facilities, but we are talking about commercial banks. And with really challenges like COVID, you now naturally default, and gradually you now have your facility going bad. And in some banks, what you have is a compounding interest. What I'm saying is that apart from regulating the amount that should be paid as the rate, the government equally needs to, and all the regulators need to do more in terms of all other things that goes with borrowing from banks. They need to reduce the cost of, let's say, creating legal mode. And the process is even very, very cumbersome. So it makes the whole idea of even getting the loans is not really as the way the average Nigerian would think, that he will walk up to the bank. What the banks are doing before the various policies have been introduced, we call it armchair banking. They sit in their various banks, they wait for the consumers to deposit monies. Most of them that are depositing are not the ones that will get the loans because they will not fit to the risk assessment criteria set by the bank. So you discover that it's only a certain group of companies, individuals that will benefit from all the deposit made by the various users. And equally, from the records from the asset management, you discover that less than 5% of Nigerians are the ones that have bad debts, and equally to translate that they equally are the ones that have those facilities that were running at a point in time. So the government should make it as a point of responsibility to ensure that the banks are actually giving out those, apart from using regulatory regimes in terms of fixing the monetary policy and the lending rate, they could look at the processes. There is a lot of the CBN have not really done enough in terms of checking what the bank do. Most of the times during their routine examination, they rely on the information supplied by the banks, and we know most banks will just give them what they need and not what is in reality. They could do more in terms of the way they gather data, in terms of assessing the consumers directly, and so far so good. You could see the impact government in its intervention are having in the economy. Talking of NASA, talking of Bank of Industry and other, because those ones, those conditionalities have been set by commercial banks largely are not there. So it improves in terms of assessing loan. Unless that is done, for commercial banks, they are out there to make profits. They've been declaring huge profits. It's been a kind of pressure on the part of the shareholders. They are not interested in having people to get facilities. What they are more interested in is the yearly returns in terms of dividends, in terms of profit. So there must be a balance in terms of regulatory functions of the CBN to see that all the aspects of lending should be checked so that people can access loans. Then in the terms of deposit, we know that banks are into the business of financial intermediation, as he rightly pointed out. But it's not enough to say that people will continue depositing their monies, they will pay the mega sum, and they will not even be able to access facilities. And I think that's where
all right, Ahmed Tanimo, thank you very much there for your explanation. You've raised a number of points along, of course, with Nia Kinsiju, and I'm sure the other guests will also have theirs. Well, one of the interesting things you mentioned has to do with the interests of the shareholders who, in your opinion, and in the circumstance of the current conversation, are more interested in the quantum of their dividends. Well, in corporate governance, that's always been a contentious issue, generally referred to as the shareholder primacy norm. But let's go over to Mr. Johnson Chukwu, CEO of Cowrie Asset Management. Mr. Johnson Chukwu, we haven't had you for a long while on Good Morning Nigeria, so a special welcome to you one more time. But the essence of all of this conversation, my colleague Jumai said her head was swelling as he was getting into the technicalities of NPR and therefore the regulatory function of the CBN. The whole process is simply this. There are people who have ideas. They need finance for those ideas to grow, not just those who are interested in buying and selling. They need they need finance for those ideas to grow, or they need finance for them to do certain kinds of things. Now, these are persons, when we talk about financial inclusion, you say go and open a bank account. Some have had bank accounts for many decades, and then when they approach their bankers for a facility and they are given the terms, of course, they run away. And the whole consequence of what we see is the rather parlor state of our economy, which ordinarily should be growing much faster and much bigger than it is at the moment. So let's have your opening salvo on this whole tension between the deposit rates, that's to say the savings rate, and then usually usurious rates that you get for banks that wish to lend to their customers, who are so very few, by the way.
Okay, once again, thank you for having me. Let me start by saying, in the first, we have to recognize that several factors determine interest rates. And I've heard my colleagues talk about the motivation that they drive by the monetary authorities to bring down interest rates. That's one factor, which is a very critical factor because the monetary authorities will, to a large extent, influence the direction of interest rates. In 2018, 2017, interest rate was so high. I mean, at that point, monetary policy rate, though, was not high, but yield on treasury bills was in the region of 18%. And that encouraged a lot of people to invest in treasury bills. And banks were ready to pay high interest rate to mobilize deposits and even invest in treasury bills and make huge spread. But over the last 1 year, interest rates on treasury bills has come down. Central bank has excluded private sector investors and non-bank financial institutions from investing in treasury in automobiles. So what you saw was a collapse of interest rates, and that meant that banks had market power because depositors were looking for a way to put their money, and the banks were ready to pay peanuts for the monies that depositors were bringing in. So you saw the collapse of interest rates on deposits was partly driven by monetary policies. Again, I hear Nii talk about the pegging of interest rate on savings at 10%, which was done effective 1st of 10% of MPR, which was done effective 1st of September last year, 2020. At which point, interest rate on savings became 1.25%. It has further dropped to 1.15% because monetary policy rate is now 11.5%. That's one aspect of the drive. What drives interest rate to depositors. The second factor is market power. Because depositors are many and few financial institutions are available, depositors want safety for their money, and therefore they go to those few financial institutions who take undue advantage of their weak bargaining power and pay them very low interest rate and enjoy so much spread on those deposits. Now, the second aspect of your question, the impact of this, given that you have a lot of budding entrepreneurs in the country who need funding and who needs to access those funding at reasonable cost so that they can actually go into productive activities, unlike trading activities that can cycle out in 90 days and therefore can take high interest rate. Productive activities that have an assets conversion cycle of 1 year, 2 years, cannot pay the kind of interest rate that traders are ready to pay. So that leaves us with how do we get funding for those category of impactful investment that will lead to the growth of the economy, creation of jobs. The most important or the most sustainable way to go about it, we need to drive down inflation rate. Remember also, inflation rate is a factor in determining interest rate. At today's inflation rate of 16.47%, you need to, for you to get what you call positive real interest return, you need to have a yield that is above 16.47%, which is not obtainable in any of the deposit instruments. So every depositor today, as it stands, is taking negative real interest return on his or her deposit where you have with the banks. Because what is happening today is that if I have to buy a product today for 100 naira, and I wait for 1 year, I have to buy that product at 116 naira for 7 kobo. And if I keep that money in a fixed deposit account, hoping that in 1 year time I will buy that product, the best I can get is maybe 3%. In fact, like I said, savings account is giving 1.15%. So if I put 100 naira in a savings account today, I will get 101 naira 15 kobo. While as a product I would have bought today at 100 naira, I need to buy it at 116 naira 47 kobo in 1 year time. What that means is that I can no longer buy that product I would have bought today. And the challenge you have with that in an economy is that it incentivizes consumption. And because instead of keeping your money in a savings account so that you can build capital and buy what you would have bought today, that is what we call delayed gratification in economics. You will now have to consume today, because if you don't consume today, you will no longer be able to afford the same product when you accumulate your savings interest to what you have saved. So that incentivizes consumption. Also incentivizes the pressure you have on FX, because people are buying more, so that, and therefore demanding some of them imported products because they really can't wait. Waiting will mean that they can't afford those things again because of depreciation of the currency and because of high inflation rate. So the first thing we need to address is we need to address high inflation rate. Instances where you have stable interest rate, all those economies have very low inflation rate. That's number one factor. that we must address. The second factor is, like my colleagues mentioned, the use of monetary policy tools. Monetary policy will direct the motivations of depositors and lenders. If you have high expansionary monetary policies, it should actually lead to lower interest rates. While contractionary monetary policies, which means the monetary authority is taking that money out of the system, it will incentivize savings, because key thing we must recognize that savings drive investment. And the investment is what we need to drive economic growth, economic recovery, job creation, and full employment.
Professor, thank you so much, Johnson Chukwu, CEO Carrier Assets. You've sort of broadened the conversation now, to inflation and policy management. Thank you so much for your input. Let's now go to our Sokoto Network Center, where Shoaibu Idris, financial analyst and member of the National Institute, is waiting. Mr. Johnson has sort of opened the door to another conversation, inside another conversation that we are having now, inflation rate and monetary policy. And interest rate has played a very crucial role in the efficient allocation of resources, aimed at facilitating growth and development. But it is also expected to have some negative effects and positive on the economic impact. What do you think?
Thank you very much, Jumai. Once again, thank you, and I appreciate you having me. I think Mr. Johnson Chukwu and indeed the other two discussants before him have done justice to the subject matter. But I think we should come down to narrow it to to the basics. What are we talking about? We have deposit money banks that have been licensed by the Central Bank of Nigeria to offer what we call financial intermediation, to take monies from the surplus end of the market and to lend to the deficit end of the market, meaning those who might have surplus and are willing, ready and able to save, they take their money to the banks, and the banks are supposed to give them a bit of incentive. Like Johnson has said, that okay, I put in my money and I'm looking at inflation today. If I come back in 6 months' time or 1 year time, my money should be, if not equal and equivalent in terms of value, at least I should not lose. What do we see today? You take your money to the banks and they pay you 1%, 2%, even when you are fixing the money, say for 90 days or 60 days or 180 days, the maximum interest rate you could be able to get is between maybe 5 to, call it 11, 12%. Now, in an economy where the inflation rate is somewhere around 15, 16%, is that fair for the banks to pay such peanuts to depositors? Are we encouraging Nigerians to save? Like Johnson has said, if you don't encourage savings, how do you get the funds to invest? If you don't invest in an economy, how do you ensure that there is going to be growth and development? And without growth and development, how do you, fight poverty? How do you create employment opportunities? How do you do a lot of things that are needed? To worsen the situation, Nigerian banks today are charging a minimum of 26-27% on lending, rates. Now, compare and contrast a 5-6% deposit rate with 26 or 30% lending rate. Look at the margin. The system will operate. Posit that every bank should display fundamentally 2-3 rates. Number one, the exchange rate. How much are you buying dollars? How much are you selling? How much are you buying sterling? How much are you selling? Second, how much are you ready to pay for deposit? From savings account to 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 180, up to 1 year. Then how much are you charging as your prime lending rate? Otherwise, how much are you giving credit to customers? Now, because the banks are themselves ashamed of themselves. That is why they are not able to even display this rate. Because how do you put in a deposit rate of 1% and a lending rate of 30%? It's criminal. It is criminal. These banks are nothing more than pen robbers. How do you just collect money from people just like that? And unfortunately, the central bank appears to be helpless. We have a system where this thing we should find a way to enforce it. If we remember, there were days when the Nigerian government used to charge supernormal profit tax on banks. And simply because these banks are reeling out figures, monies that have no correlation with the fundamentals of our economy. Which manufacturing company will be able to return a profit of 30%? Which manufacturing company, which trading company can give a return of 50%? Now we are killing this economy. These banks are killing the Nigerian economy because of the excessive rate they are charging. And when you are, like Johnson has said, look at what are the concomitant features of a typical lending rate. Number one is the saving rate. How much do you buy the money to lend? Number two, what is the cost of your operation? In today's world, where we have technology that is driving the operation of the Nigerian banks, shouldn't the cost of operation of Nigerian banks be reduced? And if indeed we are technology driven, why are we seeing not the impact of the operation being technology driven by getting a reduction in the cost of operation of these banks, and we should dovetail to reduction in funding rate. And lending rate rather, and other concomitant features like the risk element inherent in lending, as well as the insurance premium they pay to NDIC. When you look at all these, assume you start with, say, even 3%, you add the cost of operation of 6 or 5%, then you add the insurance cost of negligible 0.3 or 0.5%. How much total cost of money should the bank have? 13%, 15%? Why are we seeing the lending rate of 30%? I think it is high time, if indeed the government of Nigeria is interested in seeing maximum and rapid growth in our economy, i.e. the gross domestic product should improve, we should work towards compelling banks to pay an appropriate rate to depositors so that we can drive money instead of flight to safety, where people are having naira and they don't want to keep them nairas in the system. They would rather buy dollars or buy property, thereby not having sufficient savings. Without savings, then there is no investment, then the economy will not grow. So it's a bit of a ripple down effect, and collectively, if we don't take time, this system will collapse sooner rather than later, because the system cannot and will not be able to sustain the existing lending rate the banks are charging.
Shuaibu Idris, thank you very much for your opening salvo. A very tough shots you fired there. We appreciate your comments. Let's go over now to our Kaduna Network Center. Professor Yushau Ango, Professor of Finance and Entrepreneurship, himself also a former banker. Professor Ango, of course, you've listened to all the comments, and just as a preface, you probably will also take this along, because the view had been expressed, and we've discussed it on Good Morning Nigeria. You've been our guest, Shuaibu, Nia Kinsiju, and Johnson Chukwu. Some of the retail banking functions we see the CBN performing today ordinarily are functions that should reside with commercial banks, where we hail the CBN for doing anchor borrowers program, we hail the CBN for SME funding, we hail the CBN for all kinds of things, and yet the commercial banks or other more specialized banks that should take this up are not doing that. But our chief concern, of course, has to do with commercial and even merchant banks. And persons are beginning to ask this question, which is why, of course, we are focusing on it today. Why are we having this huge disparity between the peanuts being paid for deposits and then the almost forbidding rates that they charge for lending? Professor Ango.
Well, the reasons have been presented eloquently by the preceding speakers. One of the reasons clearly has to do with the relationship, the nature of the relationship, if you like, between the banks on the one hand, the customers who are the depositors or borrowers on the other, and the government on the other. So there is the relationship, unfortunately, is that of dominance. If you look at theoretically, there is a model of business government society relationship, and there are four of them. One of them clearly that is at work here is what is referred to as the dominance model, a model where the banks, as it were, that are at the top are having a dominant effect. It's not a relationship that is more or less you rob my back, I rob your back. It's not like that. The banks are having their way all through compared to the society, which now produces the deposits, and also have the borrowers. Why am I saying this? Shaibu, the last speaker, also said, mentioned or gave an example of the differences. And if you are looking at deposit rates of less than 5%, and you are looking at borrowing rate of 30 or thereabout percent, you can see the disparity. It's huge. Now, it's even more than that, because it's not just the other hidden charges that are also there, which will not be seen. For example, when you are given a facility, there is a signing fee, there is an acceptance fee, and then also one of the presenters or one of the speakers mentioned other agreement fees that you have to pay and all those things, such fees. There are many fees. If you look at it in effect, it's more than the 30%. But what is happening is that the banks have been allowed, to have dominance over the other sectors. And the person at fault clearly, certainly will be the central bank. But then, you look at the history, you look at the trajectory of where we're coming from. Historically, the Nigerian banking system started on a laissez-faire approach. There was no regulation per se. Up to 1952, between 1952 and 1958, when the central bank came into effect, we had some little bit of regulation, but then after 1958, up to 1985, we have strict regulation. Now, of course, we saw a lot of disadvantage of that regulation. Now, but then we now liberalized from 1986. So in liberalization, we want market forces to work. Now, if you look at the reality, the macroeconomic environment in which you operate, the inflation rate, you look at the inflation rate, you look at the exchange rate, you look at all those factors, inflation, everything, they have impact. One of the speakers had also said something about the disincentive to even save, because if you look at it realistically, if you save money, you're actually losing. But because the banks are few and the depositors are many, so they have advantage over depositors, and that is what is happening. So unfortunately, the other aspect that maybe need to also be seen is the fact that we are also subsidizing them. We are also subsidizing the inefficiency in banks. Let me give you examples. Now, banks tend to lend, sometimes they lend and move with the market. They just move with one sector. Every bank will move into one sector and lend hugely into that sector. Whereas the overall government interest is for lending to be done to the productive sectors, to the small and medium enterprise. Bank will not lend there. And that is why the central bank find other means, of intervening in those sectors. So they will lend hugely into certain sectors. In the process, they lose also hugely. And then the government is there, to again take away those, because given the number of, the nature of the banks we have now, government doesn't want to allow them to collapse because of systemic risk involved. So they will make all the risk, they will take all the risk in billions, of naira in certain sectors, and then at the end of the day, government will be responsible because government will now take over and manage the situation, at the expense of the public. So that is one. Secondly, as Shaibu mentioned, the cost of operation. Nobody regulates that for them. You know, they decide whatever is the cost of operation, and it has effect, you know, on the cost of funds, you know, as it were, in the on the credit side. That is another problem. So in a way, I think, you know, we're paying for liberalization. We cannot afford to go back to total regulation, but we need to regulate them to the extent that we don't allow them, you know, to take unnecessary risk and not go along with public interest, with the national interest, just in a bid, you know, to make profit for their own shareholders and to declare huge profit and to be seen as number one or number two or number three in terms of profitability at the expense of the general public, that is all of Nigerians.
Thank you so much, Professor Ishua Ango, for your comments. We'll now come back to the studio near Kisuju. Kingsley earlier said that there are so many people with ideas who cannot access loans, and government is saying it's taking 100 million people out of poverty. I hope you understand. And these are young entrepreneurs with their brain brimming with ideas. How can they go into a bank, walk into a bank today with your ideas like you do in developed countries and get a loan to finance your idea?
That's the financial Eldorado all of us are praying for, to walk into a bank and within 2 hours secure a loan. That's a vision that we hope will come to pass in our life.
If we need to take 100 million out of poverty, I think.
Yeah, it's important, and banks are actually instrumental to this. But I always say, whatever is still happening, the buck still stops on the table of the governor of the central bank. You know, it's still, either we like it or not, we are reviving that era of regulating the bank or the banking system, as it were. So if the banks are paying so low, it's still a policy of the CBN. If the banks are not lending so much, it's still a policy of the CBN. But the CBN, over the last 16 or 17 months, had also tried to compel banks, you know, to lend to Nigerians, especially through the loan-to-deposit ratio, the 65%, which means to say 65% of whatever you have must be lent out to interested banking customers. But of course, again, how do you also realize that? It's the same CBN that have told us now that they want lending by commercial banks to move from the 4% that prevails now. That's of their total lending credit portfolio. They've just lent us about 4% to the agricultural sector, which is supposed to be the most important, you know, sector we are looking at in Nigeria for growth, and of course for cycling out people out of poverty. So the CBN is aspiring that the money deposit bank will increase that threshold to 10%. That's a challenge. There's also my problem with the commercial, the financial institutions generally, is a reluctance to lend, you know, to SMEs especially. So even with the LDR, there's that feeling of managing risk. In fact, there's no ambition, you know, to tap into that segment of the economy. As much as I want to say that the CBN is responsible for certain policy positions, the truth of the matter still is there's no activism on the part of entrepreneurship activism on the part of most money deposit banks to engage the Nigerian entrepreneurs. And to that extent, we will be constrained. If we look at the figures, in terms of credit to the economy, especially the private sector, over the last 18 months, thereabouts, I think from September 2019 till now, there has been a quantum growth, you know, generating more than 3.9 trillion, you know. That is historical, given where we are coming from. But still, it's not enough. It's not enough in terms of the much money that is needed. It's still not enough in terms of the lending rates. The lending rates are high, but I'm also sure that it had actually declined, it had decreased from what it used to be. I was at the head of an advocacy group between 2006 and 2010 when we were fighting over hidden charges. we had handled a case where the total rate was 65%. 65%, that was the lending rate. And it was like, and the start off of that transaction, the rate was 37%. But at the end of the transaction, it had gone to 65%, you know. But I think to a large extent, there had been a manageable reduction, you know, on that. Even if you go to, if you attend, I mean, if you approach a bank now, you can still negotiate, you know. The rates are not as huge as it should be. It is still hostile anyway. The rate is still hostile now because the average rate is above 20% now. But I will also advise people, if you are interested, you must also go shopping. Don't just be fixated on a particular bank. The banks are also offering competitive rates now, you know. But the only appeal is for the central bank to be up and doing and looking at the T's and I's of agreements. Because like Prof said, and I agree, the dominance of the financial institutions generally is overwhelming, you know, and it defines the relationship between the CBN and them, so much that the CBN cannot, in the true sense of it, wield, you know, the big stick in regulating them. And that's why it has to go through, you know, lending rate, I mean, loan to deposit ratio, crashing T-bills and bonds and all that, so that it will discourage them being involved in all these side shows that were. But I think what is important now is a directive on what specific, what I don't know now, and that's what I'm trying to, well, I have tried to get what the average lending rate is in the country, either at the prime lending rate or the maximum lending rate. At least if you know this is what this bank is charging, this is what that bank is charging, you can do an average and say, okay, perhaps our prime lending rate in this country is 17% or it's 18%, but you cannot determine it. So I think there's still a need for much CBN regulatory activism in that regard.
Well, Neil, thank you very much. Your points are noted, but you said one thing, that maybe the CBN should be taking a look at the T's and the I's to see whether they are properly crossed or properly dotted. I was just wondering, what would be the privity of the contract between the CBN and the bank, and then between the banker and the customer, if the CBN then intervenes, unless of course there are broad prudential guidelines that have been issued. But there are a number of issues. I want to keep Tanimu in the meantime and go back to Johnson Chukwu via Zoom, still with us on this conversation. Mr. Chukwu, one of the issues that Niyi Shuaibu raised, Niyi Akinsiju raised rather, was the low risk appetite of deposit money banks. They're looking for the easiest way out, and Professor Ango also has classified that in a sense as part of the dominance model that we face. We saw what happened when treasury bills were the in thing. So banks themselves were the ones that were buying up treasury bills. Virtually no risk, and you were assured of a return. But something also sinister was happening at that time. If you, as a depositor, approached your bank to purchase T-bills on your behalf, you were unlikely to get the T-bills purchased for you or the quantum that you were looking for. So it was the banks themselves that were gathering all this until the CBN awoke from its slumber and said, no. Well, of course, now we have to deal with the rates of T-bills, which were very high and very enticing. So you come back again now to the regulatory model that the CBN is using, and at some point, you still find banks are finding their way around these rules and getting on. We'll come to those bouquet of charges that you find, such that even if the prime lending rate is whatever percentage, say 20%, At the end of the day, when you are paying back, unless you, of course, you are a trader, you probably will pay double that figure, if not more. So what is it that can be done to bring all of this about? It looks historical in a sense, because if you recall, even in the 90s, before the failed banks era and so on and so forth, when some banks were giving their financial statements at their AGMs, you will be seeing all kinds of claims that they were making with regard to what they were lending to the agricultural sector. At some point, it was supposed to be about 10% or so. And then you were asking yourself, well, what was the impact of this lending to the agricultural sector? And today, here we are. We're still having just the same old issues, and an economy that is contracting, an economy that is not doing well for us, whereas financial intermediation is supposed to be a catalyst for economic growth.
Okay, let me put it from this perspective. There are issues of regulatory challenges we've had in the past, which to a large extent has been addressed, and I mean seriously that it's been addressed. Like I pointed, I used to be a banker, and I knew the time when banks could render returns that were not representative of their balance sheets. When banks, at that point, there was strong regulation, but the strong regulation was not in tandem with economic realities. Where at some point, I can tell you, the banks the deposit rates were capped at 15%. I mean, in the early 90s, it was capped at 15%, but banks were taking deposits at 30%. And in their books, they would only cut 15% and have a way of capping the other 15%. At that time, there was also, lending rate was capped at 21%. So what eventually happened was the central bank realized that regulations of such definitive directive was not were difficult to implement. So they had to relax some of those caps. And what we need to be looking at this point, that how do we address the funding needs of the different segments of the economy without imposing undue regulation that will stifle creativity, or that will stifle economic growth, will stifle some industries, including the banking industry. Because in as much as we want the banks to lend, you also do not want to stifle them. So I'm not making excuses for the banks where they cut corners. In such instances, the central bank should wear the big stick, which I know in some instances they have done. But I want us to look at bigger perspective to it. And this is what is lacking in this economy, because if we do not address that, we're going to be running around a cycle and will not be addressing some critical challenges we have in the economy. Some segments of the financial system have not developed in Nigeria. Take, for instance, the private equity segment of the financial system has not developed. And in advanced countries like US, Europe, and not even China and India, you have what you call a very chunk of their financial system that is accounted for by private equity firms. What the private equity firms do is that they lend to new ventures. They don't lend, they actually invest in new ventures. They invest their funds in new ideas. Because there are some businesses that go seek for credit that they're not good credit customers, or they're not good credit candidates. I'll give you an instance. A lender who is lending you money for 1 year want to see your cash flow that you pay back in 1 year. So that means your business must not be a greenfield. Most greenfields find it difficult to get funding to support their equity operations. Greenfield means the business is a startup. Because at that point of startup, you now have the strong cash flow that you will use to pay back the loan at maturity. And that means if you go to a bank and say, look, I have a good business proposal, I want you to lend to me, they look at it and say, okay, where are you going to pay us back from? You are not even sure your business idea will find a market. You are not sure when your cash flow will start. And therefore, you cannot be able to project that, give me this money for 90 days or 1 year or 2 years, I'll be able to pay you back. Such business ideas that go to banks have no business going to banks. They should go to private equity firms. A private equity firm is not going to ask you to pay interest, because your business cannot even afford to pay interest at the early stages, at the onset, at the startup period. So what a private equity firm will tell you, okay, look, I'm going to give you the money you need to start this business idea. And you will give me 10%, 20%, 30% of the business. I will be an owner of 20 or 30% of the business. So I become an equity investor in your business. So if the business succeeds, I will cash out this 30% and make good profit. If the business fails, I lick my wound. And you as an innovative person, I'm not going to hold you. I'm not going to ask you to go and bring your mother or your father to sell to me. You move on. I will lick my wound because I have taken a bet on you and on your idea. That segment of business or the financial sector is still lacking in the country because you have very few private equity firms. If you look at all the big names we talk about, Google, Facebook, they did not go to conventional banks to borrow money. They went to private equity firms that had faith in them and put equity in them, because startups can hardly find the cash flow that supports loan payback. So what is happening in Nigeria today, every new business idea is going to the banks are not meant nor designed nor don't have the competence for private equity investment. So we need to address that. We need to also grow the venture capital segment of our financial system. It's also lacking. These are the two segments that will invest in ideas that will not give the money as a loan, but rather give the money as equity, and are ready to take the risk of the equity investment in case it bumps out. So that's one aspect we must realize, that look, some of the ideas we take the banks are not meant for the banks. Every lending activity will require a payback period. You must define how you want to pay back that loan. Every lending activity requires a cash flow projection. You must see, the lender must see your cash flow projections and see when you are going to pay back. So the next issue we need to address, how do we create an economic system that will allow private equity firms to thrive, to come up and to prosper, given that sometimes we have high lending rates. One of which is that we must evolve an investment policy guideline for the PFA that will allow them to invest in private equity firms. Today they can invest in some funds, but to invest in private equity firms is a difficult thing for them to do, because you have about 12 trillion naira, and if we are looking for impact investment in this economy, we need to look at those designed, or those institutions that have the capacity to invest in ways that will have impact on the economy. So that's one aspect. Two, we can also use tax incentives, because what happens in private equity environment is that they take huge risk. They bet on the ideas, on new ideas, and they are not asking for interest payment. So which allows the new idea to not be nurtured, grow, and have the capacity to now go into conventional borrowing. So we need to address that. The other aspect is that we need to further strengthen some of the development finance initiatives we have in the country, or development financial institution we have in the country. We have the Bank of Industries, we have the Bank of Agriculture, we have some of these specialized financial institutions or development financial institutions that were set up to intervene in some segments of the economy. Some of them lack appropriate capitalization. We need to capitalize them, and we also need to ensure that they have the necessary manpower to understand the sector where they are to operate and provide funding in those sectors, as well as handhold operators in those sectors, not just funding. Some of them also need technical support to actually grow their businesses.
Well, Johnson Chukwu, just before we go on this short break, it may be useful for you to explain to our viewers what a private equity is, and how a private equity firm is different from a venture capitalist.
Okay. A private equity firm is a financial institution that is set up to provide equity, to invest in equity of companies. In many instances, equities of startups, but sometimes they can also put equity in an operating business. So what they do is that they ask for funders, they ask for investors in their fund, and those investors who could invest in specific funds or invest in a specific general fund. What I mean by specific fund, they could actually set up a fund to say, look, this fund, we're going to use it to invest in agriculture, or invest in hospitality business, or invest in road construction. But they can also have a general fund that they can invest in any aspect of the economy. So what happens is that they will go to those surplus units, the people who are really rich, and tell them, look, put money in this, our fund. We're not paying you interest. We're going to invest this fund, and whatever return we make from this fund, we will share it across those who have invested in the fund. And what happens is that because today we have a lot of high net worth individuals who are ready to invest in funds. I mean, I chair a pension fund administrator that a PE company came to us, and we invested in one of their funds. And that fund is going to go into hospitality and some of those infrastructure development areas. And I was one of them that said, look, we need to have impact investment. So what we now need to do is to look for such private equity investment. We need to encourage funding funders funds to go into it, like I mentioned, the private equity funds, insurance funds to go into it. Then for venture capitals, they invest purely in new ideas. They don't invest in what we call brownfield. A brownfield is an operating business that needs fresh equity, but a greenfield is an idea that, or what we call a startup, where they have no cash flow, just startup. So a venture capital will invest only in startups. So you come up with a great idea, and they look through your idea, and it makes economic sense. And they believe this idea, if nurtured, can actually grow and become profitable. Maybe in 5 years, most private equity firms and venture capital will have a minimum investment timeline of 5 years, which means they are saying, look, if you give this money in 2021, the earliest we ask you to return the money is in 2026. So you have 5 years to grow this business and nurture it so that you can have the capacity to generate funds. So the difference is that a private equity firm can invest both in greenfield and brownfield, that is, can invest in both startup and even an ongoing business. Most venture capital funds only invest in pure ventures, pure ideas, pure concepts that have not been tested.
Okay, thank you so much, Johnson Chukwu. We'll now take a break. When we return, our conversation will continue. Do stay. You're welcome back to Good Morning Nigeria. Our conversation will continue. Now let's join Ahmed Abubakar Tanimu. You know, Chukwu talked about private equity firms. Do we have a functional one in this country where you can just go in and seek for help or loan to, you know, kickstart your business in this country? Is it functional?
Well, if you look at it, we have a lot of investment companies that are players in the stock market. Ordinarily, they could be approached, but with the regulation, there's need for the Security and Exchange Commission and the Act establishing it to be looked into. It boils down to the same source of funding. You are talking of people harnessing resources so that they can invest in long-term investment, but it's not really working. Even state actors like various state governments have not been able to access the capital market. Some have made attempts in the past, and it has not really, we've not really gone to that develop in that aspect. So for now in Nigeria, there are attempts at having it, but it's not really functional for business owners to want to. And it boils down to the risk assessment of businesses. A lot of Nigerians, even the regular banks, are contending with bad loans, portfolio of bad loans, especially for the retail investors. You see that some, and it boils down to even the foundation, individuals, businesses are giving loans based on who they know in the banking sector. So it equally revolves that. So you now have a large portfolio of non-performing loans. If you look at Bank of Agriculture, for example, to some it's non-existent because they cannot really see who they are giving out loans to. And now you now see banks like NASAL and NASA Microfinance Bank and the CBN, who are supposed to be regulators. When you now have regulators jumping into the arena, the question that comes to mind is, who regulates the regulators? The CBN should not be a player in the banking sector, but because you now have high rates of non-performing loans, or those specialized banks that are supposed to be intervention banks, as in failing in terms of they are not able to recoup their investments. If regulators are having challenges getting back their money, so what will now be for private equity players to invest in companies? The market is not, the environment is not conducive. But I know if the credit risk assessment of individuals and corporate bodies and companies, if things are working well for the country and they can minimize the risks, the culture of lending, you see that banks itself, they are having difficulty in that activism of lending to the borrowers because the risk factor involved. So all these are factors that should be looked into, and the regulatory regime, before we can now have a thriving private sector equity funding for companies.
Okay, thank you, Tanimo. Back to Shuaibu Idris at our Sokoto Network Center. Shuaibu, I was just wondering, you know, there are a number of ideas on the table already. Johnson Chukwu brings in the fact that we need to grow other financial services, including private equity firms as well as venture capital. But in the meantime, we have commercial banks. We also have merchant banks, as they are called, and the whole challenge of, you know, having to, as it were, close the gap between the deposit rates, that's to say interest rates, and the lending rates. That whole challenge continues to be with us. One of the sources of these usurious rates has been identified by our guest, Tenemu in particular. I talked about, you know, the whole range of hidden charges, which me, Akisuju, also exposited on. You have the fees to pay for the mortgage, you have the legal search, you have the property valuation, you have the admin fees, acceptance and signing, which Professor Ango also talked about. Is there a way some of these fees can be modulated? I'm asking because, I mean, if a mortgage is for a certain amount, you know, there are legal fees that are involved. In the meantime, the bank already has a legal department, but the bank, of course, would then say that it probably is an external legal firm that is drafting the mortgage agreement, and therefore the percentage is 5% or thereabout. The valuation fee for a property, if they value a property to be, say, 100 million, you know what that means to you already. They set all kinds of things that the legal department ordinarily is supposed to handle. Because it exists as a legal department to carry out research, and because you are a customer, and because, of course, you are going to borrow and you are going to pay back at some premium, some of these ordinarily should be taken up. Is there a way we can deal with these charges and then see how there can be some reasonable cap while we are pursuing the other options of enlarging financial institutions, including private equity firms and venture capitalists?
Kingsley, thank you for that question. But before I delve into it, let me just attempt to give Jumai a categorical answer to the question she asked my colleague Tanimu. There are some, or if I can say few, private equity firms operating in Nigeria. I know of one that has operated for the last 20-25 years called African Capital Alliance, ACA. And I'm sure my good friend Johnson Chukwu knows about the existence of private equity firms in Nigeria. Ditto, we have a few venture capitalist firms that are operating in Nigeria. And in addition to venture capital, we have a few other crowdfunding organizations that are pooling resources to help some of our young, talented Nigerians that are coming with ideas because, of course, of the charges and the near absence of credit from the Nigerian banks. So at least let's put that record straight. Our system, indeed our financial ecosystem, is gradually improving. We never had infrastructure funds. Today we have like 5-7 infrastructure funds operating in Nigeria. As of today, a team of professionals are coming with a health system infrastructure fund. Recently, the AFC, African Finance Corporation, the Central Bank, and a few other banks put heads together to come up with an infrastructure company in Nigeria. So the system is gradually developing. We never had real estate investment instrument. Today we have them even being traded in the stock market. So the system is gradually developing. But at the same time, the challenge and I think the pain of average Nigerian is the somewhat recalcitrant attitude of Nigerian banks. The excessive charges they are, labeling or collecting from Nigerians without seeing the impact of those charges either in their corporate social responsibility or in other areas that you will see them funding the development agenda of Nigeria. Let me take on your question. Fundamentally, Kingsley, there are no options to those charges. Legal fees, valuation fees, this fee, that fee. Is this peculiar to Nigeria? The answer is no. If you go to continental Europe to borrow money from any bank, you will certainly be asked to pay for valuation fee of the property you are going to pledge to the bank. If there is going to be an agreement between you and the bank, it will be morally wrong for a bank or you as the lender, even if you are a senior advocate of Nigeria, meaning you are a lawyer, that you will write the agreement you accept. So you can be a judge, a complainant, and a judge in your own court. So there has to be a lawyer, independent to draft agreement. Those, unfortunately, are the norms in the financial industry worldwide. Can these charges be regulated? Again, the answer is no. The very best anybody can do will be a kind of demand and supply, wheeler-dealer kind of agreement. I am the one wanting a loan, and there is a lawyer drafting an agreement. I can go and discuss with the lawyer to exact, maximum value, meaning to pay as little as I possibly will be able to be allowed to pay. I think, Kingsley, the issue here is when you limit this conversation to the interrelationship or the correlation between deposit rate and lending rate without necessarily even looking at the other charges, you will realize that these banks are not being fair to Nigerians. They are not being fair to Nigeria. They are not even being fair to themselves. Because when you don't fund an economy, when you don't fund, the system to generate employment, to increase growth, what do? What are we helping? We are helping exacerbating poverty. When we exacerbate poverty, what is the concomitant feature of that? Insecurity. When you are not secured, I'm not secured, the banker is not secured, what is the reason why should we not be a bit nationalistic, a bit passionate, a bit sincere, a bit reasonable, and a bit fair, that we should look at what are our charges? Like I allude to the fact that technology is a major issue that has driven cost to near zero. But are we seeing the impact of such technology in the charges that this bank, levy on our customers? The answer is no. Here, central bank needs to come in. Yusha Wango, Johnson, Ni, and Tenimo have all alluded to the fact that historically there used to be a fiat kind of regulation in the banking sector. Yes, we had financial repression, controls. Now we have financial liberalization. But to what extent will you continue to liberalize? If the presidential pronouncement of lifting 100 million Nigerians out of poverty in the next 10-15 years is anything to go by, and it will succeed, one of the things that the government needs to do is to ensure that the banks are compelled to invest, to lend in what we can call an impact investment sector. Otherwise, lifting 100 million Nigerians from poverty by government alone is impossible to achieve. There has to be all hands on deck, and one of those hands that needed to be on deck is the banks. Yusha did allude to the fact that the dominance factor. Today, we have just about 3-5 banks controlling 60% of the banking sector business. Now, is there competition? There is, if you can call, an oligopolistic market where few banks are controlling the business of banking in Nigeria, and they are determining the direction of the economy. Today we are even facing a situation where some properties in some parts of Nigeria are not being accepted as collateral. Even if you want to borrow, and they tell you that, okay, a house in Sokoto will not be allowed to be used as collateral. Where do we go from here? So there is need for a central bank to come out from the shell and be able to establish and enforce certain fundamental rules and regulations for the betterment of the country.
Shuaibu Idris, thank you very much. Thank you. I would like Professor Ango very briefly to also react to this and give us his closing thoughts. It's scandalous to hear that banks are rejecting properties in some cities in the country other than their preferred cities, usually probably Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt. Why should this be so? Where is the regulator?
Correct. In fact, that is true. In fact, and you mentioned the cities correctly also. Many banks now accept only properties in Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt. And like you also said, the responsibility is that of the Central Bank of Nigeria. We have reached a point where the banks are actually dominating everything. And like Shuaibu said, it's becoming oligopolistic. That means only 2, 3, 4 banks are actually dominating everything. I think there is need to correlate our developmental objectives of Nigeria with the performance and the acts and the activities of these various banks. Specifically, we are a growing nation. We are a nation of 207 million now. We are going to be about 400 million by 2050 based on projections. I saw a study sponsored by UK AIDS agency that said, okay, Nigeria is actually thought to be an oil economy, but in actual sense it's an SME economy. Now, if we know that it's an SME economy, whatever we need to do to support SMEs in this country, in terms of framework, in terms of structure, it should be put in place by the Central Bank of Nigeria. We also know for a fact that our GDP, 24% of it is agriculture. And a lot of these SMEs are in agriculture, especially if you look at the value chain, especially into processing and all that. We need to support that sector. Central Bank of Nigeria need to come up with structure that will be acceptable by everybody, that will lead to appropriate funding to that sector at reasonable price. We also know that the digital economy is moving on very well. Clearly, at almost 16% of GDP, it is the future. We need to support it. And a lot of those companies that are coming up in that area are SME related. We need to come up with a structure that will be acceptable to the banks, that will be at the same time supporting this SME sector. That is the future. That is the only way we can move people out of poverty. Government is doing quite a lot sincerely. Central Bank is doing quite a lot sincerely. But they don't have the capacity or the ability to themselves support and carry out these reforms. So in a way, they need to come out with regulations that will be okay, that will be acceptable, that will be comfortable to the bankers, and at the same time support this our developmental trajectory, the objective of moving out of poverty. Because in 2050, it will not be just, if you move 100 million out of poverty, you may still have 300 or 400 out still in poverty. So.
Okay, Shaibu Idris, thank you so much for your input there. Yes, Yeshua Ango, sorry. Yeshua Ango, we're sort of running out of time, and we thank you so much for your input. He's Professor of Finance and Entrepreneurship. He's also Dean, School of Postgraduate Studies, Kaduna State University. Thank you so much for coming on Good Morning Nigeria. Shaibu Idris, Financial Analyst and member of the National Institute. Thank you so much for coming too on Good Morning Nigeria. Ahmed Abubakar Tanimu, former banker and human rights activities, as always, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Johnson Chukwu, CEO, Cowrie Asset Management Limited and financial analyst. Thank you so much for your contribution to the conversation today. And our regular here always in the studio, Ni Akisuju, financial and investment analyst. A pleasure having you.
Thanks so much.
And that's Good Morning Nigeria for today. We acknowledge our tweets that came in. Time is not on our side today. Thank you so much for your contribution. I am Jumbo Yusuf. Do have a wonderful day.
I'm Kingsley Osadolo.